I was going to show you one of my six cats, but my wife won't let me. We're going to talk about Allen Ginsberg. Ginsberg is probably most famous for his long poem, How, which, if you're thinking about the history of long poems in American literature in the 20th century, the most famous one before World War II was T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which you probably attempted to read, at least. And then Ginsberg's Howl is the most famous long poem after World War II. So he's an enormously accomplished and influential poet. He was part of a generation of writers that became known as the Beat generation of writers. Most prominently, that's Ginsberg. He was the youngest of the group. Jack Kerouac and the very strange William S. Burroughs, who was for a time a cotton farmer down here in the valley. And they were born roughly in between like 1915 and 1925. Ginsberg was born in 1926, Kerouac in 22, and Burroughs somewhat earlier. And they lived, therefore, as young, as children, with the exception of Burroughs, through the Depression. And then they turned 18, 19, 20, or 21 in 1941, which is, of course, the beginning of World War II. And so they served in or were, part of the, that World War II world. And then after World War II, they lived in an age of increasing anxiety that became known as the Cold War, where people were genuinely afraid that at any moment the planet would be destroyed by these increasingly powerful nuclear bombs. Because of that, that world that they inherited, Ginsberg said that their generation was characterized as smart but crazy. And they tended to disbelieve in authority. And Ginsberg once famously said that, thinking back on his elders, here's the world that they created, one with a bunch of nuclear bombs hanging over our heads. If that's the case, why should we listen? As he said, quote, they're bullshit. They felt the same way about literature. William S. Burroughs, his friend William S. Burroughs and mentor, was famous for saying that he wanted to write anything except something that was literary. So they were very skeptical of the conventions that had taken over poetry and the novel and short story, and they were trying to write something that really upended those kinds of conventions. And I think you'll see that in the poem America, which doesn't really look much like any poem you've ever seen. But I want to talk about Ginsberg in a somewhat different light as a popular American poet. If you go to Barnes & Noble, well, can't go right now, but soon you will, and you go to the ever-shrinking poetry racks, getting crowded out by the teen vampire books and other popular literature. But if you go to the ever-shrinking poetry racks and just look at the spines of the books, you can see the ones that people have taken off the shelf, gone and had a cup of coffee or several cups of coffee, and sat there and read them. In other words, they're the kinds of poets that people, not necessarily professors or poets themselves, but just people like to read. So if you go to that rack, you'll see that Charles Bukowski's poetry books appear to have been taken off the shelf and read. He's an LA poet. He wrote very plain-spokenly. Ginsberg's collected poems often has a crease down the back because people have gotten it, and opened it up and sat there and read it. Anne Sexton's poetry, similarly, appears to have been read. And there's a small number of poets like that who have a popular following. And that could be, perhaps, because, as I said earlier, they wanted to write anything other than something that was literary. If you read, as you have, actually, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, nobody reads T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland and finishes it and thinks, man, I want to write something like that. Because he knew 7 different languages. It's a possibly erudite poem. It's really long. It just doesn't make you... Or you read all of Milton's Paradise Lost. Nobody finishes reading that and thinks, man, I want to write a book which justifies the ways of God to man as well. So a lot of literature, as you know from being a literature student, is very intimidating, particularly the books that your professors make you read. And that can, that can lead to a kind of fear of literature, distaste of literature. Ginsberg's poetry, no. And the work of the Beats in general, that's not the case. You can read America, and you will, by Allen Ginsberg, and feel, many of you afterwards, like sitting down and writing a poem in imitation of it. And you can do it.
Especially right now.
Especially right now. You can do it. It's not an impossibly difficult poem to imitate or use as a model or as a template for writing poetry. And actually, remarkably, it's really contemporary. One of the lines that I pulled out for you to look at and complete was, why should I let Time magazine, rule my emotional life? I'm paraphrasing there. Actually, I don't think I got the line correct.
Run my emotional life.
Yeah. Why should I let Time magazine, or anyone for that matter, run my emotional life? And what he means by that is, why should I let the media, whatever media it is that I pay attention to, with all of with this particular ideological spin and selective coverage and so on, why should I let that make me feel happy, sad, angry, powerful, or whatever? You probably know people who listen to left-wing commentators and constantly are spouting that opinion. Other people listen to Rush Limbaugh every day, and you get regurgitated Rush Limbaugh all the time. And so they're angry or they're happy based upon this media running their life. So I asked you to substitute something besides Time magazine, a magazine that I'm not even sure it exists in print anymore, but was a big part of my life. And even as far back as Ginsberg's life, it was a major way that people got their news every week. But you get your news somewhere else. What's running your emotional life? What news station do you listen to? What radios, what social media do you follow? Are you letting Facebook run your emotional life? Are you letting Twitter, probably the best example, are you letting Twitter run your emotional life? What is it? And Ginsberg's saying, don't let that do that. Don't, there is a you that is separate from all of that. And there are many other things in the poem that are still quite fresh. The list, the enemies that he brings up in the poem are the Russians and the Chinese, which for many, many years felt, dated. And I would ask my students, well, who's the enemy now? And they'd say, oh, it's ISIS, or it's somebody like that. And now we're full circle. We're back to them Russians, them Russians, them Russians, them Chinese, them Chinese.
And them goddamn Russians.
Yeah, and so you can, my wife is commentating on it.
Sorry.
She loves the poem. And so it is a poem that, that does not intimidate you, but makes you actually feel as if you too can contribute to this discussion. In my sophomore literature class, I do in fact have my students write their own version of America. And for my students who are not from America, I have them write their version of Mexico or whatever country they're from. And they can all do it, and many of them are absolutely amazed that they've written a poem. So perhaps the greatest achievement of a poet like Allen Ginsberg is that he and the other beat writers took writing and art and poetry off the pedestals, of academia or of, like marbled libraries, and put it back on the street where it belongs. And that's the lesson for today. Okay.
Wait. Oh, sorry.